Robert Wilson sat behind his wooden desk in the courtroom. His gray hair and stern face made most people nervous. As a judge for 15 years in the small town of Millfield, he believed in strict rules. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Outside, Millfield carried on with its quiet day, shopkeepers opening stores, children walking to school, and workers hurrying to offices. Inside courtroom 3, however, time moved differently under Judge Wilson's watchful eye. "Next case," he called out, his voice echoing against the walls. Court Officer Thomas read from his list. Emma Bennett, charged with speeding, 20 miles over the limit on Oakwood Road. Emma walked forward, standing tall despite feeling small in the large courtroom. At 34, she had worked harder than most to get where she was. Her dark, brown skin contrasted with her crisp white shirt and navy blazer. She had pulled her hair back neatly, wanting to look professional and respectful. Judge Wilson barely looked up from his papers. "Ms. Bennett, you understand the charge against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Emma replied, her voice clear and steady. "How do you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor, but I would like to explain the circumstances if I may." Judge Wilson sighed slightly. He had heard every excuse possible in his years on the bench. People rarely took responsibility for breaking the law. "Go ahead, but keep it brief," he said, glancing at the clock. Emma nodded. "Your Honor, I apologize for speeding. I was rushing to the airport because my flight schedule had changed and That will be $200, Judge Wilson interrupted, tapping his pen against his desk. "Everyone has excuses, Ms. Bennett. The mother taking children to school, the businessman late for a meeting, the student rushing to an exam. Rules apply to all." Emma pressed her lips together, stopping herself from saying more. She had hoped he might understand her situation, but his mind was already made up. "Pay the clerk on your way out," Judge Wilson said, already looking at the next file. Emma noticed how the judge barely looked at her, making assumptions without hearing her story. It wasn't the first time, and sadly, she knew it wouldn't be the last. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. As Emma turned to leave, she caught Officer Thomas giving her a sympathetic look. He had seen this scene play out hundreds of times. Judge Wilson was known for his strict approach and quick judgments. Walking to the clerk's desk, Emma took out her wallet. The $200 fine would hurt her budget this month, but there was no point arguing. She handed over her credit card, signed the receipt, and tucked it into her bag. Outside the courthouse, Emma stood on the wide stone steps and took a deep breath of fresh air. The spring morning felt good after the stuffiness of the courtroom. She checked her watch. She still had time to make it to work, but only if she hurried. A young law student named James was sitting on a nearby bench, reviewing notes for his class. He had been observing court proceedings as part of his studies, and had witnessed Emma's case. "That was quick," he commented as Emma walked past. "Judge Wilson doesn't give people much chance to explain, does he?" Emma smiled slightly. "No, he doesn't. But that's how it goes sometimes." "What were you trying to tell him?" James asked, curious. Emma looked at her watch again. "That's a story. For another day. I've got a job to get to." As she walked to her car, Emma thought about Judge Wilson. How little he knew about her life, her work, her achievements, how quickly he had dismissed her based on a single mistake. "One day," she murmured to herself, starting her car, "maybe he'll see me differently." She drove carefully through Millfield's streets, making sure to obey the speed limit. In her rearview mirror, the courthouse grew smaller until it disappeared completely. Emma turned on the radio, letting the music lift her spirits as she headed toward the airport. Little did she know that in just 3 weeks she would see Judge Wilson again in very different circumstances, ones that would change both their perspectives forever. The end 3 weeks passed quickly. The courthouse and Judge Wilson faded from Emma's mind as she focused on her work. She had been a pilot for 8 years now, earning her position through hard study and countless hours of training. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Judge Wilson sat in the airport lounge with a cup of tea growing cold beside him. His flight to Edinburgh for an important legal conference had been delayed twice already. Outside, rain poured down in sheets, washing the runways and obscuring the view of planes waiting on the tarmac. Third announcement of a delay, grumbled an elderly man seated nearby. We'll be lucky to leave at all in this weather. Judge Wilson checked his watch and frowned. He had planned everything carefully. The flight, the taxi to his hotel, dinner, with the conference organizers. Now everything was falling apart because of rain and airport inefficiency. Important people are waiting for me, he muttered to himself, tapping his foot on the floor. He opened his briefcase and reviewed his speech notes again, though he had already memorized most of it. The overhead speaker crackled to life. Good afternoon, passengers of Flight 372 to Edinburgh. This is your captain speaking. The voice was confident, professional, and female. We apologize for the delay due to weather conditions. Our ground crew is completing final preparations and air traffic control has given us a new departure time. Safety is our first priority. We expect to begin boarding in approximately 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Judge Wilson frowned. Something about that voice seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. He gathered his carry-on bag when boarding finally began 30 minutes later and joined the queue of tired, impatient travelers. Rain continued to beat against the terminal windows as passengers slowly filed through the gate. Judge Wilson handed his boarding pass to the attendant and made his way down the narrow jetway, the smell of wet concrete and jet fuel filling the air. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the door to the cockpit was open. The captain was completing pre-flight checks, her back to the boarding passengers. When she turned around to speak to a flight attendant, Judge Wilson caught a glimpse of her face. It was Emma Bennett. She looked different in her captain's uniform, confident, authoritative, at home in the complex environment of the cockpit with its hundreds of buttons, screens, and controls. 4 gold stripes gleamed on her shoulders, marking her rank and experience. Emma turned further and their eyes met. Her professional smile faltered for just a second when she recognized Judge Wilson. "Welcome aboard, Your Honor," she said politely, recovering quickly. Judge Wilson stood frozen in the narrow aisle, causing passengers behind him to bump into his back. The woman he had dismissed so quickly in his courtroom, whose explanation he hadn't bothered to hear, was now responsible for flying him and over 100 passengers safely to Edinburgh through a storm. "Good afternoon," he managed to say, before a flight attendant gently guided him to move along. He found his seat and sat down heavily, his mind racing. As he fastened his seatbelt, he couldn't stop thinking about their courthouse encounter. What had she been trying to tell him that day? That she was a pilot rushing to her flight. The plane began to push back from the gate. Emma's voice came through, the speakers again, calm and assured as she introduced her co-pilot and gave safety information. Soon after, the powerful engines roared to life and the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway. During takeoff, the plane shook as it cut through the stormy air. Judge Wilson gripped his armrests tightly, but Emma's steady hand guided the aircraft smoothly into the dark skies. Rain pelted the windows as they climbed through thick clouds. "We're experiencing some rough air," her voice announced a few minutes later. "I've turned on the seatbelt sign. We'll be above these clouds shortly where the ride will be smoother." Judge Wilson listened, impressed by her knowledge and authority. He thought about how quickly he had judged her, never giving her a chance to explain who she was or what she did. How many others had he treated the same way in his courtroom? As the plane broke through the cloud layer into sunlight, Judge Wilson looked out at the endless blue sky above the storm. For the first time in many years, he felt the uncomfortable weight of self-doubt. The Endema sat in the captain's chair, perfectly composed despite the storm raging below them. Flying had always been her safe place. Up here above the clouds, she was judged only by her skills and decisions, not by her appearance, not by assumptions. She checked the instruments, making small adjustments to their course. Her co-pilot, Paul, handled radio communications while she focused on navigating through the rough weather system stretching across northern England. "Edinburgh reports strong crosswinds," Paul noted, writing down the latest update. "They're asking if we want to hold until conditions improve." Emma considered this information. Holding patterns meant burning extra fuel and passengers would grow more anxious. She studied the weather radar, noting a small gap forming in the storm system. Tell them we'll continue as planned. I see a better approach path developing. Paul nodded, trusting her judgment. Emma had earned a reputation for calm decision-making in difficult conditions. That's why the airline often scheduled her for routes with challenging weather. In the passenger cabin, Judge Wilson sat stiffly in his window seat. He had declined the offer of tea from the flight attendant, his mind still processing the unexpected situation. The woman he had fined and dismissed so quickly 3 weeks ago now held his life in her hands. The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, dropping suddenly before stabilizing. A few passengers gasped. Judge Wilson gripped the armrests tighter, his knuckles turning white. Emma's steady voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Bennett. We're navigating through a storm system that stretches across our route. I've chosen an alternate approach that should give us a smoother journey. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please take your seats for now. Judge Wilson listened to her confident tone. There was no hint of uncertainty or fear, just professional expertise. He found himself relaxing slightly, trusting in her abilities despite the rough flight. A young boy sitting across the aisle looked frightened as the plane shook again. Are we going to crash? He asked his mother loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Of course not, she replied, squeezing his hand. Our captain knows exactly what she's doing. Judge Wilson surprised himself by nodding in agreement. Yes, she certainly does, he said quietly. The mother smiled gratefully at him, not knowing the complicated history between him and the captain. In that moment, Judge Wilson felt the weight of his own prejudices. How quickly he had dismissed Emma based on appearance alone, never considering her capabilities or circumstances. In his courtroom, he had the power to interrupt her, to silence her explanation. Up here in her domain, she commanded respect without having to demand it. As the flight continued, Judge Wilson found himself watching how the crew responded to Captain Bennett's instructions with immediate action and complete trust. When she spoke, people listened. When she gave orders, they were followed without question. Had he been too quick to judge throughout his career? How many stories had he cut short? How many explanations had he waved away? The questions made him uncomfortable. The plane began to climb higher, seeking smoother air above the worst of the storm clouds. Through breaks in the cloud cover, Judge Wilson caught glimpses of the patchwork countryside below. Small villages, winding rivers, green fields bordered by stone walls. Emma's voice came through again. We'll be starting our descent into Edinburgh in about 20 minutes. The weather at our destination has improved, though we still expect some turbulence on approach. I've chosen a route that should minimize discomfort. Flight attendants will begin preparing the cabin shortly. As the plane broke through the last layer of clouds into clear air, sunlight flooded the cabin. Several passengers visibly relaxed. Judge Wilson found himself admiring how Emma had guided them through the worst of the storm with skill and precision. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. As they began their final approach to Edinburgh, the city came into view, the castle on its hill, the straight lines of the new town, the waters of the Firth of Forth glittering in the distance. Despite the reported crosswinds, the plane touched, down with barely a bump. Emma's control was masterful, the result of years of practice and natural talent. When the aircraft reached the gate and the engines quieted, spontaneous applause broke out among the passengers. Judge Wilson found himself clapping too, acknowledging a job well done. The end passengers filed off the plane, many stopping to thank the crew as they left. Judge Wilson remained seated, watching people gather their bags and children. His mind was busy with new thoughts he couldn't ignore. After most passengers had disembarked, he finally stood and collected his briefcase. Instead of following others, toward the exit, he paused near the cockpit door. Emma was still inside, completing her post-flight checks and paperwork. For a moment, Judge Wilson considered simply leaving without saying anything. What could he say? That he was sorry for not listening to her explanation about being a pilot? That he was impressed by her skills? That he was questioning his approach to judgment after all these years? Sir, do you need assistance? Asked a Flight attendant named Mary, noticing him standing there. I was hoping to speak with the captain briefly, Judge Wilson replied. Mary looked uncertain. She's quite busy with her duties, but I can check if she has a moment. While Mary went to speak with Emma, Judge Wilson stood awkwardly in the empty cabin. The plane felt different now, quieter, smaller without the crowd of passengers. Emma appeared in the cockpit doorway, surprise visible on her face. Your Honor, is everything all right? Captain Bennett, he said, his voice lacking its usual courtroom authority. I was hoping for a word, if you have time. Emma glanced at her watch. I have a few minutes before my next briefing. What can I do for you? Judge Wilson shifted uncomfortably. First, I want to compliment you on a smooth flight through difficult conditions. Your skill is evident. Thank you, Emma replied, professional but guarded. And I want to... He paused, struggling with words that didn't often pass his lips. Apologize for our previous interaction. Emma's expression softened slightly. In the courtroom? Yes. I didn't give you a chance to explain your circumstances. I made assumptions. A silence fell between them, filled only by the distant sounds of airport announcements and the cleaning crew beginning to enter the plane. You were speeding because you needed to get to the airport, Judge Wilson continued. For your job, as a pilot. Emma nodded. Yes. My schedule had been changed last minute due to another pilot's illness. I was worried about letting down my crew and passengers. Judge Wilson felt a twinge of shame. I've spent 15 years on the bench making quick judgments. It becomes a habit, seeing people as cases rather than individuals with complex lives. Out the window, ground crew moved around the plane, refueling and preparing for its next journey. Life continued its swift pace all around them. May I ask you something, Captain Bennett? Judge Wilson said. Of course. How did you become a pilot? It's not a common profession, especially for... He stopped himself, realizing he was about to make another assumption. Emma smiled slightly. For a woman of color? No, it's not common. My father was in the Royal Air Force. He took me to air shows, as a child. I fell in love with flying then and never changed my mind. She paused. There were many obstacles, many people who didn't believe I belonged in the cockpit. But you persisted, Judge Wilson said. Yes, because up here, it doesn't matter what I look like or where I come from. What matters is my ability to fly this plane safely. A maintenance worker entered the cabin, nodding politely as he passed them. I should let you get back to your duties, Judge Wilson said. But I wanted you to know that today's flight has given me something to think about. Emma studied him thoughtfully. We all have responsibilities. In your courtroom, you uphold the law. Up here, I'm responsible for lives. Both require careful judgment. And seeing the complete picture, Judge Wilson added. Something I failed to do in your case. The co-pilot, Paul, appeared from the cockpit. Emma, dispatch is asking about our fuel consumption report. I'll be right there, she said before turning back to Judge Wilson. I hope you enjoy the legal conference, Your Honor. Thank you, he replied. And thank you for the safe journey. As Judge Wilson finally left the aircraft, he felt strangely lightened. Something had shifted inside him. A recognition of his own fallibility, perhaps. The certainty with which he had always rendered judgments now seemed less absolute. Outside the terminal, Edinburgh welcomed him with a cool breeze and clearing skies. The storm had passed here too. Judge Wilson hailed a taxi and gave the driver his hotel address, his mind still on the conversation with Captain Bennett. First time in Edinburgh? The driver asked cheerfully. No, Judge Wilson replied. But I think I'm seeing it with new eyes. The end. The legal conference kept Judge Wilson busy for 3 days. He gave his planned speech, attended workshops, and exchanged ideas with other judges. But his mind often wandered back to his encounter with Captain Bennett. On the final morning, he skipped the closing breakfast and instead walked through Edinburgh's old streets. The ancient buildings and narrow lanes offered a quiet place to think. He found himself at the top of Calton Hill, looking out over the city and the distant sea. 15 years on the bench, he said to himself. How many people have I truly seen? That afternoon, Judge Wilson returned to the airport for his flight home. He glanced at his boarding pass. A different airline, a different flight number. He felt a strange mix of disappointment and relief that Captain Bennett wouldn't be flying him home. When he returned to Millfield the next day, the courthouse seemed different somehow. He walked through the familiar corridors, nodding to staff, members who greeted him with the usual respect. Court was in session at 10 o'clock. Judge Wilson took his place behind the bench, arranged his papers, and signaled to Officer Thomas to bring in the first case. James Miller charged with parking violations, Officer Thomas announced. A young man in his 20s approached the bench. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his tie. Mr. Miller, you have 3 unpaid parking tickets. How do you plead? Judge, Wilson asked. Guilty, Your Honor, James replied. But if I could explain, Judge Wilson lifted his hand, about to cut him off as he always did. Then he paused, remembering Emma in her captain's uniform saying, both require careful judgment and seeing the complete picture. Please, Judge Wilson said, surprising Officer Thomas. Go ahead and explain your situation. James blinked, not expecting this opportunity. I've been caring for my grandmother who had a stroke. The hospital parking is expensive, and sometimes I couldn't move my car in time because she needed me. I know that's not an excuse, but I've been stretched thin with hospital bills and taking time off work. In the past, Judge Wilson would have considered this just another excuse. Today, he listened carefully. Do you have proof of your grandmother's hospitalization, he asked. Yes, Your Honor. James quickly produced several hospital documents from his folder. Judge Wilson examined them. I see. Mr. Miller, the law still applies even in difficult circumstances. However, the court can show discretion. He paused. I'll reduce the fine by half, and you can pay in installments over 3 months. And I hope your grandmother recovers. Soon. Thank you, Your Honor, James said, looking relieved and surprised. Throughout the morning, Judge Wilson found himself asking questions he'd never bothered with before. With each case, he tried to understand the whole story before making his decision. During the lunch break, Officer Thomas approached him. If you don't mind me saying, Your Honor, you seem different in court today. Judge Wilson smiled slightly. Let's just say I received an important lesson recently. That evening, as he was leaving the courthouse, Judge Wilson noticed a newspaper on the reception desk. The headline caught his eye. Local pilot honored for emergency landing. The article featured a photo of Emma Bennett receiving an award from the airline. According to the story, she had safely landed a plane after an engine malfunction, saving the lives of all on board. Judge Wilson read the article twice. Emma was quoted saying, I just focused on what needed to be done. When you're responsible for others, you can't let fear take over. The next morning, Judge Wilson did something unusual. He visited the clerk's office and asked to see the record of Emma's speeding ticket. After some searching, the clerk found the file. I'd like to issue a refund of the fine, Judge Wilson said. Sir? The clerk looked confused. On what grounds? Judge Wilson thought for a moment. Let's call it judicial discretion in light of new evidence. 2 weeks later, Emma received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a check refunding her $200 fine, along with a short note. Captain Bennett, justice is not just about following rules but understanding the people behind the cases. Thank you for the lesson in seeing the complete picture. With respect, Judge Robert Wilson. Emma smiled as she read the note. She pinned it to her kitchen bulletin board next to her pilot's license and latest commendation. That same day in courtroom 3, Judge Wilson began the morning session with a new approach. Before the first case was called, he looked around at the nervous faces waiting their turn. The purpose of this court, he announced, is not just to apply the law, but to see that justice is done. And justice requires understanding the full story. He nodded to Officer Thomas. Let's begin. Outside, Millfield carried on with its quiet day, shopkeepers opening stores, children walking to school, and workers hurrying to offices. But inside courtroom 3, something had changed for the better. The end.